Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When I found out my parents were asking me to share my inheritance with my brother, I couldn't believe the nerve they had. This was the same brother they bought a vacation home for while leaving me to fend for myself when I was drowning in medical debt. Now, they're wondering why I don't call or visit anymore. Seriously? It was a lazy Saturday afternoon when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my mom. Her name flashing on the screen wasn't unusual, but the overly cheery tone in her voice when I answered immediately set off alarms. My mom didn't do sweet. She did straightforward and occasionally passive-aggressive. But this was suspicious. "Hi, honey," she started, her voice dripping with an unfamiliar warmth. "Your dad and I were just talking, and we think it's time we have a family discussion. Something important." I already knew this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. "What's going on?" I asked cautiously. "Well," she said, dragging out the word like she was trying to ease into something. "You know about the inheritance your grandparents left you, right?" Of course I knew. My grandparents, bless them, had always been thoughtful about things like that. When they passed a few years ago, they left me a significant amount of money. It wasn't life-changing wealth, but it was enough to give me a solid safety net, something I'd never had growing up. "Yes, I know about it," I replied, my tone guarded. "Well," she continued, "your dad and I were talking, and we think it would be really nice if you considered sharing some of it with Tom. He's been having a tough time lately, and it would mean so much to him." The air left my lungs like I'd been punched. "What?" I asked, genuinely stunned. "We're not asking for all of it," she added quickly, as if that made it better. "Just a portion. To help him out." It wasn't just the request that floored me. It was how casual she was about it. Like this was no big deal. Like asking me to share my inheritance with my brother, Tom, was the most natural thing in the world. My mind immediately went back to the lowest point in my life, when I'd begged my parents for help, and they'd refused without a second thought. Back then, I'd been dealing with a life-threatening medical condition. My insurance had denied coverage for a critical treatment, and I was desperate. I'd swallowed my pride and asked my parents for help, thinking that surely they'd step in. But no. I could still picture the way they'd looked at me, cold and detached, as my mom said, "We can't afford it." 2 months later, they posted photos on Facebook of Tom holding up the keys to his brand-new vacation home. "So proud of our son and his new investment," the caption read. An investment, they called it, though it was really just a luxury property for Tom to host his endless stream of parties. I pulled myself back to the present, my mom still talking on the other end of the line. She was saying something about family and sticking together, but I wasn't really listening anymore. My mind was racing, replaying all the times they'd favored Tom over me. "I'll think about it," I finally said, cutting her off. I just wanted to end the conversation. "Oh, thank you, sweetie," she gushed, clearly misreading my tone. "This will mean so much to your brother." I hung up and stared at my phone, seething. There was no way I was giving Tom, or my parents, a single cent. They didn't lift a finger to help me when I was desperate, so why should I now? That night, I couldn't sleep. The conversation replayed in my head over and over again, each time stoking the anger I'd buried years ago. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they didn't understand how serious my situation had been back then. Maybe they really believed Tom needed the help more than I did. But no matter how I spun it, the facts didn't change. When I was fighting for my life, they turned their backs on me. When Tom wanted a luxury purchase, they bent over backward to make it happen. And now they had the audacity to ask me to share my inheritance with him? The worst part was, I knew this wouldn't be the last I'd hear about it. My parents weren't the type to let things go, especially when it came to Tom. This was just the beginning, and I had a sinking feeling that things were about to get messy. Growing up, I always knew the scales weren't balanced in our family. My brother, Tom, was the golden child, and I was the resilient one. At least, that's what my parents liked to call it. But let's not sugarcoat it. I was the afterthought. Tom had the kind of childhood I used to dream about. He got brand new clothes every season, while I inherited his hand-me-downs, whether they fit or not. When he decided he wanted to play guitar, my parents signed him up for private lessons and bought him a top-of-the-line instrument. Meanwhile, I had to beg for permission to join the school art club because it came with a $20 fee. By the time he was 16, they'd gifted him a shiny new car, something modest but reliable. I, on the other hand, was told that if I wanted wheels, I'd better start saving. So I babysat, worked part-time at the local diner, and finally managed to scrape together enough for an old clunker that broke down every other week. I remember asking my mom once why Tom got so much more. She sighed like it was the most obvious thing in the world and said, "Tom needs a little more help than you. You're independent. You'll figure things out." That became their go-to excuse for everything. Independence was a trait I hadn't asked for, but it was one they clung to as a justification for neglect. Still, I held on to this naive hope that when push came to shove, when something truly serious happened, they'd show me the same care and attention they lavished on Tom. That hope died the day they refused to help me with my medical bills. I was 23 when I was diagnosed with a rare condition that required expensive treatment. My insurance wouldn't cover it, and the hospital bills were piling up fast. I tried every avenue I could think of: payment plans, financial aid programs, even crowdfunding. But it wasn't enough. Asking my parents for help was a last resort. I hated the idea of doing it, but I was desperate. I called them one evening, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, even though my voice was trembling. "I need about $10,000 to cover the treatment," I told them, my throat tight. "I can pay you back once I get back on my feet." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before my mom finally said, "We can't afford that right now." I tried to push back, asking if they could at least loan me part of the amount or co-sign for a medical loan. But they shut it down immediately. "We're not in a position to help," my dad said firmly. That was it. End of discussion. 2 months later, I logged onto Facebook and saw the post. My parents standing next to Tom in front of a 2-story beachfront property. "So proud of Tom and his new investment," the caption read, accompanied by a string of emojis. An investment. That's what they called the vacation home they'd helped him buy. They co-signed the mortgage, and I later found out they'd also gifted him a hefty down payment. Tom wasn't working. He never had. But apparently, my parents believed in his entrepreneurial spirit enough to bankroll his new venture. The truth was, it wasn't an investment at all. It was a luxury purchase. Tom used the place for weekend getaways with his girlfriend, throwing lavish parties that he'd brag about on social media. Seeing those photos felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the money. It was the message. They weren't willing to lift a finger to help me when I was fighting for my life. But they'd move heaven and earth to make sure Tom could live out his fantasy of being a real estate investor. For years, I tried to convince myself that maybe they didn't understand how serious my situation was. Maybe I hadn't communicated the urgency well enough. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. They just didn't see me as someone who needed or deserved their help. I thought about confronting them, but what would it change? They made their priorities clear, and I didn't have the energy to fight for something they weren't willing to give. So I did what I always did. I figured things out on my own. I worked myself to the bone, picking up extra shifts and taking freelance gigs just to stay afloat. It was exhausting, and there were times when I felt like giving up. But eventually, I managed to scrape together enough to cover the treatment. It wasn't until years later that I realized how deeply their favoritism had shaped me. I'd spent my entire life believing that I had to fend for myself because no one else would. It made me resilient, sure, but it also left me with this gnawing sense of bitterness that I couldn't shake. And now, after all that, they had the audacity to ask me to share my inheritance with Tom. The same Tom who'd been handed everything on a silver platter while I struggled just to survive. It was almost laughable. Almost. I didn't cut my parents off right away, though looking back, I wonder why I held on as long as I did. Maybe it was some lingering hope that they'd come to their senses, realize how unfair they'd been, and apologize. I thought if they just understood how serious my situation had been, they'd see things differently. I remember the day I sent my mom an article about my medical condition. It detailed the severity of the disease, the financial strain it placed on patients, and the long-term impacts even after treatment. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I just wanted them to know what I'd been through. Her response? "You'll figure it out. You're tough like that." That one sentence broke something in me. Tough. That was the word they always used to justify neglecting me. I wasn't tough. I was exhausted. I was fighting for my life with no safety net, no one to catch me if I fell. But to them, my resilience wasn't something to admire. It was an excuse not to help. I tried calling my dad a few days later, hoping he might have a different perspective. He was always quieter, less outwardly dismissive. But when I brought up the topic, he sighed heavily and said, "We all have our burdens to bear. You'll get through this." It wasn't just heartbreaking. It was infuriating. I wasn't asking for a handout. I'd made it clear I was willing to pay them back once I got back on my feet. I even suggested we work out some kind of loan agreement, but they didn't care. Meanwhile, Tom was living it up. His social media accounts were a never-ending highlight reel of his carefree life. Pictures of him lounging on the deck of his vacation home, hosting pool parties, and captioning everything with hashtags like hashtag blessed and hashtag living the dream. It made me sick. At one point, I tried to bring it up in a family group chat. I asked my parents why they were willing to co-sign a mortgage for Tom when they couldn't even loan me enough to cover a life-saving treatment. My mom's response? It's different. Tom needed a boost to get started. I didn't even know how to respond to that. What kind of twisted logic made buying a vacation home for their already coddled son more urgent than helping their daughter survive a medical crisis? Over time, the bitterness started to seep into everything. I couldn't look at family photos without remembering how unsupported I'd felt. I avoided calls and texts because I knew they'd just lead to more frustration. Still, I didn't cut ties completely. A part of me still clung to the hope that things might change. It wasn't until I recovered, after years of hard work, sleepless nights, and relentless determination, that I finally realized I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. By then, I clawed my way out of debt, rebuilt my life, and finally felt stable. But the scars of their indifference remained, and I knew I couldn't keep subjecting myself to their neglect and favoritism. So, I made a decision. I packed up my life and moved to a different city. I didn't make a big announcement or tell them I was leaving. I just quietly slipped away, changing my number and starting fresh. For a while, it worked. The distance felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. Without their constant presence, I finally had space to heal and focus on my own happiness. I thought I'd left all the drama behind, that I could finally move on from the years of resentment. But then came the inheritance drama. It started with a voicemail from my mom. She sounded unusually chipper, almost like she thought we were on good terms. Hey, sweetie, your dad and I were talking, and we think it's time for a family discussion about the inheritance your grandparents left you. Call us back when you get a chance, okay? I knew something was off immediately. My mom didn't do chipper. The way she said family discussion sent a chill down my spine. I called back, more out of curiosity than anything else. The moment she brought up sharing the inheritance with Tom, my stomach turned. She didn't even try to ease into it. She just said it outright, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He's been having a tough time lately, she explained, and we think it would mean so much if you could share some of it with him. We're not asking for all of it, just a portion. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they'd put me through, after years of struggling to survive on my own while they coddled Tom, they now had the audacity to ask me to give him part of my inheritance? Why can't you help him? I asked, my voice tight. Well, we've already done so much for him, she said, her tone almost exasperated. It's your turn to step up. I didn't even know how to respond. I ended the call as quickly as I could, telling her I'd think about it, just to get her off the phone. But there was no way I was giving Tom, or my parents, a single cent. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the wall, replaying the conversation over and over again in my head. The audacity, the entitlement. It was like they didn't even see me as a person, just a resource to be exploited whenever Tom needed help. I knew this wasn't the end of it. My parents weren't the type to let things go, especially when it came to Tom. But I was done playing the role of the overlooked, undervalued daughter. Whatever came next, I was ready to stand my ground. It had been months since my mom's call about the inheritance, and though I hadn't officially cut them off, I had stopped engaging. I didn't answer their calls, left texts unread, and avoided any family gatherings I caught wind of through mutual connections. For the first time in my life, I was living without the constant cloud of their manipulation hanging over me, and it felt incredible. That's why I was so surprised when I saw my dad's name pop up in my email inbox one morning. He wasn't much of a communicator, especially not digitally. He preferred phone calls, or, more accurately, delegating all communication to my mom. So, seeing an email from him was strange enough. But the subject line was even stranger. An apology. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Dear my name, it began. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and I realize we haven't always been fair to you. Your mom and I might have made mistakes over the years, especially with how we treated you compared to Tom. If you ever felt like we didn't support you enough, I want you to know that it wasn't intentional. We've always loved you, even if it didn't always seem that way. I stopped reading for a moment, my heart pounding in disbelief. My dad wasn't the type to apologize, ever. He'd built his entire personality around being stoic and unyielding, the kind of person who would sooner dig a hole in the backyard than admit he was wrong about anything. For a brief, fleeting moment, I felt the tiniest sliver of hope. Maybe this was it, the moment of accountability I'd been waiting for my whole life. But then I kept reading. I need to be honest with you about why I'm writing this now. Your brother is in trouble. He's been having some financial difficulties, and the bank is threatening to repossess the vacation home. It's been hard on him, and we're worried about how he'll cope if he loses it. Your mom and I are tapped out financially, and we were hoping you might be able to help him out, just this once. There it was. The real reason for the email. I stared at the screen, feeling like an idiot for even briefly believing this was about me. The apology wasn't for my sake. It was just a preamble to soften me up before the real ask. They wanted me to bail Tom out. Again, I didn't respond. I didn't even bother drafting a reply. Instead, I closed my laptop and sat there, oscillating between rage and resignation. They'd shown me time and time again where their priorities lay, and yet somehow, a part of me still hoped they'd change. Over the next few weeks, the messages started piling up. My dad left voicemails, alternating between guilt-tripping and reasoning. I know we've made mistakes, but family is family, he said in one. Don't let your brother lose everything. You're the only one who can help. My mom wasn't much better. She sent me a series of texts, each one more dramatic than the last. Tom is struggling, and it's breaking our hearts to see him like this. We've done so much for you. Can't you do this one thing for your brother? Ignoring us is cruel, and it's not how we raised you, not how they raised me. I almost laughed out loud when I read that one. How they'd raised me was exactly why I wasn't falling for this manipulation anymore. I started blocking their numbers, but they found other ways to reach me. My mom messaged me on Facebook, where she kept things more public, probably in the hope that I wouldn't ignore her if other people could see the messages. One post read, "It's so painful when your own child refuses to help their sibling in need. Family is supposed to stick together." That one stung more than I wanted to admit, not because I felt guilty, but because I knew how easily people could be swayed by her version of events. My mom had always been good at painting herself as the victim, and I didn't doubt for a second that she was already spreading her narrative to extended family. Sure enough, I started getting messages from aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years. One aunt called me outright, leaving a voicemail that said, "I don't know what's going on between you and your parents, but they're devastated. You should call them back. Tom needs your help." It wasn't just the calls, either. Another uncle emailed me directly, saying, "We're family. We don't turn our backs on each other, no matter what. Your mom is really upset. Can you at least hear her out?" Every message made my blood boil. Where were all these concerned relatives when I was drowning in medical debt, begging for help? Not a single one of them had stepped up for me, but now they were crawling out of the woodwork to defend Tom's right to a vacation home. It was infuriating. The final straw came when my parents sent a letter to my workplace. I hadn't even realized they knew my office address, but sure enough, one day an envelope with my mom's handwriting landed on my desk. Inside was a long, handwritten note, mostly a repeat of everything they'd already said, but with a few new flourishes. "Tom has always looked up to you," my mom wrote, which was laughable considering he barely acknowledged my existence growing up. "If you let the bank take his house, it will crush him. Is that something you're prepared to live with?" What was I supposed to say to that? Yes, I was prepared to live with it. I wasn't going to light myself on fire to keep Tom warm. Not anymore. I knew ignoring them would only make them more desperate, but at this point, I didn't care. They made their bed. Now they could lie in it. It was a sunny Saturday morning when the knock came at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so at first, I thought it was a delivery. But when I opened it, I found my parents standing there, looking uncomfortable and out of place in my apartment building's narrow hallway. "Hi, honey," my mom said, her voice shaky but determined. She clutched her purse like it was a lifeline, her face already red and blotchy, as if she'd been crying, or was about to. My dad stood behind her, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, staring at the floor like he'd rather be anywhere else. I froze, caught between shock and annoyance. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "We need to talk," my mom said. As a family, I didn't even bother inviting them in. Instead, I stepped into the hallway, shutting the door behind me. If this was going to turn into some kind of ambush, I wasn't letting them do it in my own home. "What is this about?" I asked, crossing my arms. My mom's lip quivered, and she launched into a rehearsed speech. "This situation with your brother has gotten out of hand. He's going through so much right now, and we don't know what else to do. You're ignoring our calls, and it's tearing the family apart." "Tearing the family apart?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" "Yes," she cried, her voice cracking. "We're a family, and families stick together. You're turning your back on us, and on your brother, when he needs you the most." I couldn't stop the laugh that escaped me. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when you're so angry, you don't know what else to do. You think I'm the one turning my back? Are you serious right now? My dad finally spoke up, his voice low and hesitant. We're just trying to make things right. Your mom and I. Make things right? I interrupted. Where was that energy when I was drowning in medical debt? When I needed help to survive? Or do only Tom's problems count as real problems? My mom's face crumpled, and she started crying in earnest. We didn't know, she sobbed. You've always been so independent. We thought you were okay. There it was again. The independence excuse. I felt my anger boil over. I wasn't okay. I snapped. I was begging you for help, and you said no. You didn't even try to help me. But when Tom wanted a vacation home, you moved mountains to make it happen. How do you justify that? Tom needed extra support. My mom said weakly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He's different. You know that. Different? I echoed, shaking my head in disbelief. He's lazy. That's what he is. And instead of holding him accountable, you've spent his entire life coddling him and letting him off the hook. Meanwhile, I've had to scrape and claw for every single thing I have, and you've done nothing but stand by and watch. That's not fair, my dad said, finally looking me in the eye. We did what we thought was best at the time. No, I said, my voice steady but firm. You did what was easiest. And now you're here, trying to guilt me into cleaning up your mess because you finally realized you can't keep enabling him forever. My mom started crying harder, and my dad sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. But Tom's in trouble now, he said. Like that explained everything. I stared at him for a long moment, my jaw clenched. Finally, I said, so was I. The silence that followed was deafening. My dad looked away, and my mom's sobs quieted, though tears were still streaming down her face. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I'm done, I said. I've spent my whole life being second place to Tom. I've spent years picking myself up when you let me fall. And now, after everything, you want me to sacrifice my inheritance, my future, to save him from his own mistakes? No, I won't do it. But we're family, my mom whispered, her voice barely audible. Are we? I asked. Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like I'm just the backup plan when Tom's latest investment doesn't pan out. And I'm not doing it anymore. With that, I turned around, opened my door, and stepped inside. I paused for a moment, my hand on the knob, and said over my shoulder, "Don't come here again." Then I closed the door. I stood there for a long time, listening as they shuffled away down the hallway. Part of me felt guilty, not for what I'd said, but for how final it all felt. I knew this was going to change things permanently, and even though I was sure I'd made the right decision, it still hurt. But as the minutes passed, the guilt started to fade, replaced by a sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd finally stood up for myself. And no matter what came next, I knew I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their mess again. It didn't take long for the fallout from my hallway confrontation with my parents to ripple through the family grapevine. I'd barely settled back into my routine when the messages started coming in. Texts, voicemails, even a couple of emails from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. The first message was from my Aunt Carol. "I've been hearing some concerning things about you from your mom," it began. "She says you're refusing to help your brother during a really tough time. Family is family, sweetheart. You should consider doing the right thing." I read the message 3 times, my blood boiling a little more with each pass. Aunt Carol was one of those relatives who'd always believed my mom's word was gospel, no matter what the truth actually was. Of course, she had no idea what really happened. She just had my mom's skewed version of events, which I was certain had been expertly crafted to make me look like the villain. The next message came from a cousin I barely knew, and it was even more pointed. "I can't believe you're hoarding the inheritance like that. What's wrong with you? Tom's your brother. If the roles were reversed, he'd help you in a heartbeat." I actually laughed out loud at that one. The idea of Tom helping anyone but himself was so absurd. It was almost funny. Almost. By the end of the week, the whispers had turned into a full-blown smear campaign. My mom had clearly gone into overdrive, calling up every aunt, uncle, cousin, and second cousin she could think of to tell them about her ungrateful daughter who was tearing the family apart. What she conveniently left out, of course, was everything leading up to this. She didn't mention the years of favoritism, the vacation home, or the time they abandoned me when I needed life-saving medical treatment. She didn't tell them about how I'd begged for help and been told, "We can't afford it," only to watch as they turned around and showered Tom with everything he wanted. No, her version of the story was simple. Tom was in trouble, and I was being selfish. By the time my Uncle Rick called to gently remind me that family was more important than money, I'd had enough. I decided it was time to set the record straight. That night, I sat down with my laptop and typed out a long post on social media. I didn't hold back. I started by explaining the full context, how my parents had refused to help me when I was struggling with medical debt, how they dismissed my pleas for assistance, and how they'd instead chosen to fund Tom's luxurious lifestyle. I included the details about the vacation home, the endless parties, and the co-signed mortgage they'd been so eager to provide for him. "I'm not hoarding the inheritance," I wrote. "I'm protecting the only piece of stability I've ever been given. For years, I've had to fend for myself while my parents poured their time, energy, and money into Tom. Now they're asking me to sacrifice what little I have to bail him out of a mess he created. I've made my decision, and I stand by it." I didn't name names, but I didn't need to. Anyone who read the post would understand exactly who and what I was talking about. Before hitting post, I sat there for a moment, hesitating. Part of me worried about the fallout. My mom wasn't going to take this lying down, and I knew I'd be stirring up even more drama. But then I thought about all the guilt-tripping messages I'd received, all the lies my mom had undoubtedly told, and all the years I'd stayed silent to keep the peace. Screw that, I thought, and hit post. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post had dozens of comments and even more likes. Friends, co-workers, and distant family members flooded my inbox with messages of support. Some shared their own stories of family favoritism and manipulation, while others simply told me how proud they were of me for standing up for myself. But what surprised me most were the messages from family members who'd believed my mom's lies, until now. One of my cousins, who'd previously sent me a snide message, replied to my post with, "Wow, I had no idea. I'm so sorry you went through that." Even Aunt Carol, my mom's most loyal supporter, sent me a text. "I didn't realize things were this bad. Your mom didn't tell us the whole story. I'm sorry for jumping to conclusions. Not everyone was on my side, of course." My mom responded with her own post, vague but clearly aimed at me, about how some people air their dirty laundry online instead of having mature conversations like adults. My dad stayed silent, as he always did, and Tom? Well, Tom didn't say a word, but I noticed he unfriended me on every platform. That was fine by me. In the days that followed, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't experienced in years. For so long, I'd been carrying the weight of my family's dysfunction on my shoulders, bending over backward to maintain a relationship with people who didn't respect me. Finally, I'd drawn a line in the sand. Of course, I knew this wasn't the end of it. My mom wasn't going to give up that easily, and I had no doubt she'd find new ways to try to guilt or manipulate me. But for now, I was content to let her stew in the reality I'd laid bare for everyone to see. If she wanted to play the victim, that was her choice. But I wasn't going to play along anymore. A week after my social media post, I received an unexpected message from Tom. To say I was surprised would be an understatement. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since he'd turned our parents' favoritism into a competition neither of us had agreed to. Tom and I had never been close. He was too busy basking in his golden child status to notice me, let alone treat me like a sibling. So when his message popped up, I knew this wasn't going to be a casual, "Hey, how's it going?" I opened it cautiously, already bracing myself for the worst. "Hey," it began. "I wanted to reach out because I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding between us. I'm sorry if things seemed unfair in the past. I never wanted you to feel like I was taking advantage of Mom and Dad's support." I snorted out loud. Seemed unfair? That was a generous way to describe a lifetime of blatant favoritism. The message continued, "But right now, I'm in a really tough spot. I know you've probably heard about the issues with the vacation home, and I hate to even ask, but can we talk about splitting the inheritance? I think it would be the right thing to do." There it was. The real reason for his sudden interest in me. I stared at the screen, my stomach turning. He hadn't even bothered to pretend this was about reconnecting or apologizing. It was just another plea for money, dressed up in the barest attempt at civility. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed my laptop and went for a walk, trying to sort through the mix of anger and disbelief bubbling up inside me. When I finally sat down to reply, I decided to keep things simple. "Why do you think you deserve any of the inheritance?" I asked. His response came quickly, as if he'd been waiting for me to take the bait. "It's not about deserving," he wrote. "It's about helping each other out. You're doing fine now. You don't even need the money. But I'm struggling. The bank is breathing down my neck, and I'm running out of options. This inheritance could make a huge difference for me." I read his message twice, each time feeling my blood pressure rise. The entitlement was staggering. He hadn't even tried to hide it. In his mind, the fact that I was doing fine automatically meant I should give up part of my inheritance to bail him out of a mess he'd created. I took a deep breath before typing my response. The only reason I'm doing fine now is because I worked my ass off to get here, I wrote. I struggled for years to dig myself out of the debt I was in. Debt I wouldn't have had if our parents had been willing to help me when I needed it most. Meanwhile, you've spent your entire life being handed everything on a silver platter. And now, because you've squandered what they gave you, you expect me to pick up the pieces? His reply came almost immediately. Wow, I didn't realize you were still so bitter about the past. This isn't about me squandering anything. It's about family. I'm asking for help because I'm in a tough spot, and you're punishing me over old grudges. That's cold-hearted, even for you. Cold-hearted. The words hit me like a slap, not because they hurt, but because they were so absurd. For years, I'd bent over backward trying to earn even a fraction of the support and care our parents had lavished on him without question. And now, because I wasn't willing to sacrifice what little I'd managed to build for myself, I was the one being called cold-hearted? I didn't even bother responding. I blocked him instead. That night, I sat in my apartment, replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out why it had affected me so deeply. It wasn't like Tom's entitlement was new. It had been a defining trait of his for as long as I could remember. But this felt different. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't even tried to understand my perspective. Or maybe it was the way he dismissed my struggles as irrelevant, as if the years I'd spent clawing my way out of debt didn't matter because I'd eventually made it. Whatever the reason, his words lingered, gnawing at me long after I'd cut off contact. But as the days passed, the anger started to fade, replaced by something else, clarity. For years, I'd been carrying the weight of my family's dysfunction, bending and twisting myself to fit into a role that was never meant for me. I'd let their favoritism define me, their neglect shape me, and their expectations control me. Not anymore. Tom's desperate plea had been a wake-up call, a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I had to lose by letting them drag me back into their mess. I wasn't responsible for his mistakes, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my future to bail him out. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally free. I thought the worst was over after I blocked Tom, but I should have known better. My parents had never been the type to back down quietly, especially when they felt entitled to something. Just a few days after cutting off Tom, I opened my email to find a new message from my mom. The subject line read, "Please read this, it's important." I sighed, debating whether to even open it. Part of me wanted to delete it unread, but curiosity got the better of me. I clicked, and the email unfolded before me in all its manipulative glory. The first few paragraphs sounded almost apologetic, though I knew better than to take them at face value. "Dear my name," it began. "Your dad and I have been doing a lot of thinking, and we realize things have gotten out of hand. We hate that the family has become so divided, and we want to find a way to move forward together. You mean so much to us, and it hurts us to see you pulling away like this." I rolled my eyes. They always did this, starting with warm, vague platitudes to soften me up before dropping the real bombshell. Sure enough, the tone shifted about halfway through the email. That being said, the next paragraph began, "We can't ignore the fact that Tom is struggling right now, and as a family, we need to come together to support him. We've tried everything we can to help, but our resources are limited, and he's still at risk of losing the vacation home. We're asking you, one last time, to consider sharing part of your inheritance with him. It's not just about the money. It's about showing him that he's not alone and that his family stands behind him." By the time I got to the final paragraph, my hands were shaking with anger. "We don't want to pressure you," it said, "but we need to be honest about how important this is to us. If you're unwilling to help Tom, we'll have no choice but to reevaluate our relationship with you. Family is built on mutual support, and if you're not willing to be a part of that, we don't know how we can move forward." There it was. The ultimatum. Either I sacrificed part of my inheritance to bail Tom out, or they would reevaluate their relationship with me, which, knowing them, was a polite way of saying they'd cut me off entirely. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever, my emotions swinging wildly between anger and relief. Anger because, even now, they still couldn't see me as a person. To them, I wasn't their daughter. I was just another resource to be tapped whenever Tom needed help. They didn't care about my struggles, my boundaries, or my well-being. All that mattered was keeping their golden child afloat. But the relief surprised me. It wasn't the relief of someone avoiding a conflict. It was the relief of clarity, of finally seeing things for what they were. For years, I've been fighting for scraps of their affection, trying to prove myself worthy of the love and support they so freely gave to Tom. And now, for the first time, I realized I didn't care anymore. Their ultimatum wasn't a threat. It was a gift. It gave me permission to let go, to stop chasing a relationship that had always been one-sided. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and let the weight of their words settle over me. Then I opened my laptop, typed a single sentence in reply, and hit send. Do what you need to do. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in my life, my parents didn't call, text, or email. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was nothing. I heard from mutual relatives that my mom had been devastated by my response, telling anyone who would listen that I was heartless and selfish for turning my back on the family. But I also noticed something else. The messages from extended family began to taper off. My social media post had already laid the groundwork for people to see the truth, and now that my parents' manipulative tactics were on full display, even their staunchest supporters were starting to question their narrative. One aunt reached out privately to tell me she admired my courage. "I don't think I could have stood up to them like that," she wrote. "You're braver than you realize." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. A month later, I received one last email from my parents. It was short and to the point, with none of the emotional manipulation or guilt-tripping I'd come to expect. "We've decided to respect your wishes and will no longer contact you. This is not the outcome we wanted, but you've made your choice. We hope you find happiness in your life." I sat there for a long time after reading it, letting the finality of their words sink in. This was it, the end of my relationship with my parents. And while a part of me mourned the loss of what could have been, a larger part felt a sense of liberation. I'd spent my whole life fighting for their approval, but now I understood that their approval had never been mine to earn. They'd chosen Tom as their priority, and no amount of effort on my part was ever going to change that. I closed the email, deleted it, and logged out of my inbox. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had built a life for myself, one they could never take credit for, and for the first time, I was truly free. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. I didn't feel the crushing sadness or overwhelming guilt I'd once feared. Instead, I felt light, like I'd finally put down a burden I'd been carrying for far too long. For years, I'd been told that family was everything. But now I understood the truth. Family isn't about blood. It's about the people who show up for you, who care for you, and who respect your boundaries. And if my parents couldn't be that for me, then they weren't my family anymore. True to their word, my parents stopped reaching out. It wasn't immediate. There were still a few straggling attempts at guilt-tripping emails and voicemails in the first couple of weeks. But once it became clear that I wasn't going to budge, the silence set in. At first, it felt strange. For all the toxicity and manipulation, they were still my family. Or at least, they had been for most of my life. Their absence left an odd emptiness, not painful but noticeable, like the ghost of a headache. I found myself replaying memories of our interactions, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, something that might have salvaged the relationship. But as the weeks turned into months, that emptiness began to fill with something else, peace. Without the constant shadow of their favoritism hanging over me, I felt like I could finally breathe. My days were no longer punctuated by tense phone calls or guilt-ridden emails. I didn't have to brace myself every time my phone buzzed, wondering what fresh demand or thinly veiled insult awaited me. Instead, I threw myself into my work and my relationships, the ones that truly mattered. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during my years of struggling to prove myself to my parents. I started taking weekends off for the first time in years, exploring the city I'd moved to and indulging in hobbies I'd long neglected. It was in this newfound quiet that I realized just how much space my parents' drama had occupied in my life. For so long, their opinions and approval, or lack thereof, had been the driving force behind so many of my decisions. Now that they were gone, I felt lighter, freer, like I was finally living for myself instead of for their impossible standards. Of course, the grapevine didn't go silent. Even though my parents weren't contacting me directly, updates about them and Tom still trickled in through extended family. The first big news came about 3 months after our falling out. My cousin Lisa casually mentioned during a phone call that Tom had officially lost the vacation home. "The bank foreclosed on it," she said, her voice hushed like she was sharing state secrets. "Your parents tried to help him, but apparently they couldn't come up with the money in time. It's been a huge mess." I wasn't surprised. Tom had never been one for responsibility, and it was only a matter of time before his reckless spending and lack of income caught up with him. What had surprised me, though, was what Lisa said next. I heard your parents are struggling now, too. They're dipping into their retirement savings to keep things afloat. That gave me pause. My parents had always been frugal to a fault, except, of course, when it came to Tom. For them to touch their retirement savings meant things were worse than I'd realized. Over the next few weeks, more details emerged. Apparently, my parents had poured tens of thousands of dollars into trying to save Tom's vacation home, but it still wasn't enough. The foreclosure had wiped out a significant portion of their savings, and now they were scrambling to make ends meet. It was ironic, really. They'd sacrificed so much to support Tom, bending over backward to give him every advantage they could, but now they were paying the price. Meanwhile, I was thriving. It wasn't lost on me how poetic the situation was. For years, I'd struggled in their shadow, fighting to build a life for myself with no help from them. Now, I was finally stable, financially secure, emotionally grounded, and they were the ones floundering. Still, the news didn't bring me any satisfaction. If anything, it left me feeling hollow. I didn't want my parents to suffer, even after everything they'd done. But I also knew it wasn't my responsibility to save them from the consequences of their choices. I thought that would be the end of it, that my parents would quietly fade into the background, too proud to ask for my help, but too ashamed to admit their mistakes. But then came one final twist. It started with a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Hi, my name," came a familiar voice. It was my dad. I froze, unsure of how to respond. It had been months since I'd heard from either of my parents, and I wasn't sure I wanted to break that streak now. "Look, I know you probably don't want to hear from me," he continued, his tone uncharacteristically subdued, "but I need to talk to you. It's important." I hesitated, torn between hanging up and letting him say his piece. Finally, I sighed and said, "What is it?" There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. But then he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mom and we made a lot of mistakes. I know that, and I'm not calling to make excuses or to ask for anything. I want to make things right before it's too late." His words caught me off guard. My dad wasn't one for emotional conversations, and the vulnerability in his voice was so foreign, it almost didn't register. "What do you mean, too late?" I asked, suspicion creeping into my tone. There was another pause, longer this time. Finally, he said, "Your mom's been sick. We didn't want to tell anyone, but it's serious." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, letting the weight of his words hang in the air between us. "I know we don't deserve your forgiveness," he continued, "but if there's any chance you can find it in your heart to talk to her, I think it would mean the world to her." I ended the call shortly after, my emotions a tangled mess. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect the peace I'd worked so hard to build. But another part of me, smaller, quieter, but persistent, wondered if this was my chance to find closure. I didn't know what I was going to do, but one thing was certain. The story wasn't over yet. Months had passed since my dad's unexpected call. While I hadn't completely closed the door on the idea of reconnecting with my parents, I also hadn't rushed to open it. His revelation about my mom's illness weighed on me, but I wasn't ready to face them, not yet. Then, one morning, I received a letter that would change everything. The envelope was thick and formal, with a return address for a law firm. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, wondering what fresh drama was about to land in my lap. Inside was a neatly typed letter from my grandparents' lawyer. It began with the usual legal jargon, but as I read further, my eyebrows shot up. Apparently, my grandparents had anticipated the kind of chaos their inheritance might cause. While they'd left me the bulk of their savings outright, they had also set aside a second, smaller inheritance specifically for Tom. The catch? He would only receive it if he could prove that he'd held down a full-time job for an entire year. I couldn't help it. I laughed out loud. My grandparents had always been sharper than my parents gave them credit for. While my mom and dad had spent their lives enabling Tom, my grandparents clearly saw him for who he really was. The letter went on to explain that the conditions of the inheritance were non-negotiable. Tom couldn't cheat his way around them, and there was no way to appeal. He had to provide documented evidence of employment, including pay stubs and signed verification from his employer, for 12 consecutive months. It was, frankly, brilliant. I could only imagine Tom's reaction when he found out. He'd probably assumed he was entitled to a share of the inheritance with no strings attached, just like everything else in his life. Now, for the first time, he was being held accountable, and not by me, but by the very people he'd likely thought were his biggest cheerleaders. I found myself wishing I could be a fly on the wall when the lawyer explained the terms to him. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the fallout to reach me. A few days later, I got a message from one of my cousins, who seemed more amused than anything. "Did you hear about the conditions on Tom's inheritance?" she wrote, followed by a string of laughing emojis. "He's losing it. He says it's unfair and that your grandparents were out of touch." I wasn't surprised. Tom had never held a job in his life, unless you counted the occasional half-hearted attempt at freelancing that he'd abandoned as soon as it became inconvenient. The idea of him sticking to a full-time job for an entire year was almost laughable. Still, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of hope. Maybe this would be the wake-up call he needed. Maybe, for once, he'd rise to the occasion instead of expecting someone else to bail him out. But deep down, I wasn't holding my breath. In the meantime, I was thriving. Using my inheritance, I'd finally paid off the last of my medical debt, a burden that had weighed on me for years. With that chapter of my life officially closed, I was able to focus on building a future for myself. I used part of the money to start a small business, something I'd always dreamed of but never thought was possible. It wasn't easy. There were long hours and countless challenges, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly in control, not just of my finances but of my destiny. As for my parents, they hadn't contacted me since my dad's call. I wasn't sure if that was because they were respecting my boundaries or because they were too embarrassed to face me after everything that had happened. Either way, I was okay with it. The peace I'd found in their absence was something I wasn't willing to give up. About 6 months later, I heard through the family grapevine that Tom had attempted to meet the conditions of his inheritance. He'd taken a job at a local retail store, and for the first time in his life, he was working regular hours. The news was met with a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. Some family members were impressed, saying it was about time he stepped up. Others, like me, wondered how long it would last. Sure enough, it didn't. Just 3 months into the job, Tom quit, citing unreasonable expectations and toxic work culture. It was exactly what I'd expected, though I couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. I'd hoped, however briefly, that he might prove me wrong. Instead, he went back to relying on my parents, who were now in even worse financial shape than before. By the time the lawyer reached out again to officially close Tom's case, it was clear he wouldn't be receiving his inheritance. The money my grandparents had set aside for him would instead be donated to charity, as per the contingency clause in their will. When I found out, I couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. My grandparents had always believed in fairness, and this was their way of ensuring that fairness extended even after their passing. As for me, I've moved on. My business is growing, my friendships are stronger than ever, and I've found a sense of peace that I never thought was possible. I still think about my parents from time to time, wondering if they'll ever see the harm they caused, or if they'll go to their graves believing they were in the right. But I've stopped letting those thoughts consume me. For the first time in my life, I'm truly free from their expectations, their manipulation, and their judgment. And that, I think, is the greatest inheritance I could have ever received.